The morning fog clung to the windows of Murphy's diner like secrets waiting to be told. Inside, the familiar symphony of clinking coffee cups and sizzling bacon created a soundtrack that had remained unchanged for decades. Tommy Mitchell sat in his usual corner booth, the red vinyl cracked from years of faithful service, much like the man himself. At 68, Tommy wore his age in the deep lines around his eyes and the careful way he moved his left shoulder. His gray hair was neatly combed, and despite wearing a simple flannel shirt and worn jeans, there was something unmistakably dignified about his posture. The other regulars knew him as the quiet guy who always left generous tips and never complained about anything. "More coffee, Tommy?" asked Sarah, the waitress who'd been working the morning shift for 15 years. "Thank you kindly, darling," he replied with a gentle smile that never failed to brighten her day. The bell above the door chimed as Rebecca Chen entered, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and her press badge visible on her navy blazer. As an investigative reporter for the Portland Tribune, she'd heard whispers about a local veteran claiming to have served in classified naval operations. Her editor had assigned her to debunk what he called another stolen valor case. She scanned the diner until her eyes landed on Tommy. According to her research, this unassuming man claimed to have been involved in covert operations that, frankly, sounded like something out of a Hollywood movie. Antes de continua, like Ian Screvisi pera não perder outras historias de heróis, que a vida esconde atrás de aparências simples. Rebecca approached his table with the confidence of someone who'd exposed dozens of fraudulent claims. "Excuse me, are you Thomas Mitchell?" Tommy looked up from his newspaper, studying her face with the kind of attention that made her slightly uncomfortable. "I am, and you are." "Rebecca Chen, Portland Tribune. I'd like to ask you some questions about your military service." She slid into the booth across from him without invitation. "I see." Tommy folded his newspaper carefully. "What specifically would you like to know?" Rebecca pulled out her recorder and notebook. "Let's start with your claim about serving on a nuclear submarine during the Cold War. According to my sources, there's no record of a Thomas Mitchell serving in the capacity you've described." Tommy's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Records can be complicated things, Miss Chen. Some missions weren't meant to leave paper trails." "That's convenient," Rebecca said, her tone sharp. "It's also exactly what I'd expect someone making false claims to say." The diner seemed to grow quieter around them. Sarah glanced over nervously, recognizing the tension building at Tommy's table. Other patrons began to notice the confrontation unfolding in their peaceful morning sanctuary. "I understand your skepticism," Tommy said quietly. "It's your job to question stories that seem too extraordinary. But I've never claimed to be anything more than a man who did his duty." Rebecca leaned forward. "A duty that supposedly involved infiltrating Soviet naval bases and retrieving classified documents. Come on, Mr. Mitchell. You run a small auto repair shop. You live alone in a modest house on Elm Street. Does that really sound like the life of some secret agent?" Tommy's weathered hands remained steady as he reached for his coffee cup. "Sometimes the most important work is done by people others would never suspect." "That's a nice philosophy, but I deal in facts." Rebecca's voice carried across the diner now. "And the fact is, there's no evidence supporting any of your claims. The Navy has no record of the operations you've described." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Other customers had stopped pretending not to listen. Sarah stood frozen by the coffee pot, watching the man she'd served for years being publicly challenged. Tommy studied Rebecca's face for a long moment. "You're very good at your job, Miss Chen, but perhaps you should consider that some stories run deeper than the surface allows." Rebecca left the diner feeling confident about her upcoming exposé. Back at the Tribune offices, she dove deeper into Tommy's background, determined to uncover the full extent of what she believed was an elaborate deception. The newsroom buzzed with its usual energy. Phones rang constantly, keyboards clattered, and the smell of strong coffee permeated everything. Rebecca had carved out a corner desk where she'd built a reputation for methodical investigation and uncompromising truth-telling. "Any luck with your stolen valor story?" asked Marcus, a fellow reporter who specialized in local politics. "It's going to be easier than I thought," Rebecca replied, spreading documents across her desk. "This guy claims he was part of some top-secret submarine program, but there's absolutely nothing in official records. No service medals on display, no military memorabilia, nothing. He lives like a monk." She'd spent hours researching Tommy's public records. He owned Mitchell's Auto Repair, a small garage that had operated on the outskirts of Portland for 30 years. His tax records showed modest but consistent income. His credit report revealed a man who paid his bills on time and lived well within his means. There were no red flags, but also no evidence of the extraordinary military career he claimed. "Have you talked to his neighbors?" Marcus suggested. Rebecca had already planned that step. Over the next 2 days, she canvassed Elm Street, knocking on doors and asking about Tommy Mitchell. The picture that emerged was remarkably consistent. A quiet, helpful neighbor who fixed cars for half the market rate, who shoveled elderly neighbors' driveways without being asked, and who somehow always appeared when someone needed help. "Tommy's a godsend," said Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old widow who lived next door. "When my furnace broke last winter, he had it running again within an hour. Wouldn't take a penny for it either." "Has he ever talked about his military service?" Rebecca asked. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "Tommy doesn't talk much about himself. I know he served, but he's not one to brag. Some folks are just private that way." Similar stories emerged from every conversation. Tommy Mitchell was universally respected, but no one could provide details about his past. If anything, the lack of information only strengthened Rebecca's conviction that his military claims were fabricated. On Thursday afternoon, she returned to Murphy's Diner, hoping to corner Tommy again. She found him in the same booth, reading a paperback novel this time. "Mr. Mitchell, I have some follow-up questions." Tommy looked up calmly. "Of course you do. I've spoken with your neighbors, researched your business, examined public records. Everything points to you being exactly what you appear to be, a small-town mechanic. So why the elaborate military fantasy?" Tommy closed his book and looked out the window at the busy street. "Miss Chen, what do you think makes a hero?" "I beg your pardon. It's a simple question. In your experience, what qualities define a heroic person?" Rebecca frowned. "I'm not here to discuss philosophy. I'm here to get the truth about your false claims." "Maybe those are the same thing," Tommy said softly. "Maybe the truth is more philosophical than you realize." "That's enough riddles," Rebecca said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I'm going to publish my story tomorrow. Local Mechanics Military Fantasy Exposed. Unless you can provide actual proof of your service, I suggest you prepare for some uncomfortable attention." Tommy nodded slowly. "I understand you have a job to do. But perhaps you might consider waiting just a little longer." "Why, so you can cook up some fake documents?" "No," Tommy said, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. "So you can learn the difference between proof and truth." Rebecca left the diner more determined than ever. She spent that evening polishing her article, crafting sentences that would methodically dismantle Tommy Mitchell's claims while exposing the broader problem of military imposters. By midnight, she was satisfied with her work. The story would run in tomorrow's edition, and by weekend, Tommy Mitchell's comfortable anonymity would be shattered. Rebecca Chen had built her career on moments like this, when careful investigation triumphed over comfortable lies. She had no idea that her world was about to change completely. Friday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and the rustle of newspapers being delivered across Portland. Rebecca's article appeared on page 3 of the Tribune under the headline, "Local Mechanics Military Fantasy, When Stolen Valor Hides in Plain Sight." The piece was thorough and damning. Rebecca had laid out her investigation methodically, contrasting Tommy's extraordinary claims with his ordinary life. She'd quoted several veterans advocates about the harmful effects of false military claims and included statistics about stolen valor cases nationwide. At Murphy's Diner, the breakfast crowd was buzzing with conversation about the article. Sarah moved between tables, watching customers read and discuss the story about their regular customer. Some shook their heads in disappointment, while others seemed skeptical of the reporter's conclusions. Tommy arrived at his usual time, moving through the restaurant like a man walking through a gentle storm. Conversations quieted as he passed, though not from hostility, more from uncertainty about how to react. "The usual Tommy?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle with concern. "Please, darling. And don't you worry about any of this nonsense." Rebecca had positioned herself at a table near the front window, laptop open, ostensibly working on follow-up stories, but actually observing the reaction to her exposé. She watched Tommy settle into his booth with the same calm dignity he'd displayed throughout her investigation. The morning crowd gradually thinned, leaving only the most dedicated coffee drinkers and Rebecca, who found herself increasingly uncomfortable under Tommy's occasionally glancing looks. There was no anger in his expression, no betrayal or hurt, just a patient sadness that made her question nothing and everything simultaneously. Around 10 o'clock, the diner's bell chimed with unusual authority. Rebecca looked up to see a man in his 50s entering, wearing a crisp uniform that immediately commanded attention. His bearing was unmistakably military, and the insignia on his shoulders indicated high rank. The newcomer scanned the diner with practiced efficiency before his eyes settled on Tommy's booth. Without hesitation, he walked directly over and stood at attention. "Commander Mitchell," he said in a voice that carried clearly across the now-silent restaurant. Tommy looked up from his coffee with a slight smile. "At ease, Admiral, and it's just Tommy now, has been for a long time." The word Admiral sent a shock through the diner. Rebecca's laptop froze mid-keystroke as she stared at the scene unfolding before her. The uniformed man, Admiral James Harrison, according to the nameplate on his chest, sat down across from Tommy with obvious respect. "I apologize for the delay in getting here, sir. I was in D.C. when my aide showed me the newspaper article." "No need to apologize, James, though I suspect our young reporter might have some questions." Admiral Harrison turned to look directly at Rebecca, who felt suddenly exposed under his authoritative gaze. "Miss Chen, I presume." Rebecca nodded, unable to find her voice. "I think we need to have a conversation," the Admiral said, "all three of us." The diner had fallen completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds seemed muted as every person present realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sarah stood motionless by the coffee pot, her mouth slightly open. Tommy gestured to the empty space beside him. "Please sit down, Miss Chen. I believe it's time for some truth." Rebecca's mind raced as she gathered her laptop and moved to Tommy's booth. Everything she thought she knew was crumbling around her, and she wasn't sure whether to feel terrified or excited by what she might be about to learn. Admiral Harrison waited until she was seated before speaking again. "Miss Chen, your article contains several factual errors that I'm here to correct, but first, I want you to understand something. The man sitting across from you is one of the most decorated naval officers in modern American history." Rebecca's throat felt dry, but the records you accessed, Harrison interrupted gently, represent about 5% of Commander Mitchell's actual service. The rest remains classified at levels most people don't even know exist. Tommy placed a weathered hand on the table. "The truth, Miss Chen, is often more complicated than the evidence suggests." Admiral Harrison opened a leather briefcase and withdrew a thick folder marked with security classifications Rebecca had only seen in movies. The weight of the moment pressed down on the small diner as he carefully selected specific documents. "What I'm about to share with you," Harrison began, "represents a partial declassification authorized at the highest levels of government. The full story of Commander Mitchell's service may never be completely public, but enough can be revealed to correct the record. Rebecca's journalistic instincts warred with her growing realization that she'd made a catastrophic error. I don't understand. If he was so highly decorated, why is there no trace in any database I could access? Tommy answered quietly, because, Miss Chen, some service is designed to leave no trace. The most effective operations are those that never officially happened. Admiral Harrison nodded. From 1975 to 1995, Commander Mitchell led a classified submarine program called Deep Current. The operations were so sensitive that all personnel involved were given alternate service records. The missions you dismissed as fantasy were real, and they potentially prevented World War III on at least 2 occasions. He slid a photograph across the table. It showed a much younger Tommy in dress uniform, standing beside what was clearly a high-ranking Soviet naval officer in what appeared to be a formal setting. This was taken in 1987, Harrison explained. Commander Mitchell had just concluded a 3-month deep cover operation that resulted in the peaceful resolution of a nuclear standoff in the Baltic Sea. The public never knew how close we came to catastrophe or how one man's courage and ingenuity prevented it. Rebecca stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the decorated naval officer with the quiet mechanic she'd been so quick to dismiss. But why continue the deception? Why not reveal his service when he retired? Tommy's eyes held a lifetime of secrets. Because real heroes don't need recognition, Miss Chen. They find satisfaction in knowing they've served something greater than themselves. Admiral Harrison continued pulling documents from the folder. Commander Mitchell received the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and the Intelligence Star, awards that exist in classified records only. After retirement, he chose complete anonymity rather than the comfortable military consulting career we offered him. I opened a garage, Tommy said simply. I wanted to fix things with my hands, to live a quiet life after 20 years of living in shadows. Sarah, who had been listening from behind the counter, finally approached the table. Tommy, why didn't you ever say anything all these years? Tommy looked at her with gentle affection. Because it doesn't matter what I was, Sarah. What matters is who I choose to be every day. Rebecca felt the full weight of her mistake settling over her. I need to retract the article immediately. I need to. No, Tommy interrupted. You did exactly what a good reporter should do. You investigated claims and demanded evidence. The problem isn't with your journalism. It's with a system that sometimes requires heroes to remain hidden. Admiral Harrison addressed Rebecca directly. What I can tell you is this. Thomas Mitchell conducted operations that saved countless lives. He infiltrated enemy installations, retrieved vital intelligence, and neutralized threats that could have destabilized global peace. He did this not for glory or recognition, but because his country needed him to do what others couldn't. The diner remained completely silent as the magnitude of the revelation sank in. Regular customers who had known Tommy for decades were learning that the humble mechanic who fixed their cars and shoveled their walks was actually one of America's greatest unsung heroes. The Navy wanted to give him a ceremony when he retired, Harrison continued. Full honors, public recognition, the works. He declined everything except the right to disappear into normal life. Tommy smiled at Rebecca's stunned expression. You see, Miss Chen, sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places. The question isn't why I chose anonymity, it's why you assumed that heroism had to look a certain way. Rebecca realized she was witnessing something far more important than a story correction. She was learning about the difference between surface truth and deeper reality, between evidence and understanding. The morning sun streamed through the diner windows, illuminating a scene that would change how she viewed both journalism and human nature forever. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Murphy's diner as Admiral Harrison finished packing his classified documents. The lunch crowd had come and gone, but word of the morning's revelation had spread through Portland's tight-knit community like ripples across still water. Rebecca sat across from Tommy, her laptop closed, her certainty shattered and rebuilt in the span of a few hours. The article she'd written with such conviction now seemed like a monument to her own assumptions about what heroism looked like. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I made judgments based on incomplete information." Tommy shook his head. "You owe me nothing, Miss Chen. You did your job with the tools you had available. The real question is what you do with this new information." Admiral Harrison stood to leave, but paused at their table. "Miss Chen, I want you to understand something. There are thousands of men and women like Commander Mitchell, people who have served in ways that can never be publicly acknowledged. They live among us as teachers, mechanics, shopkeepers, nurses. They chose service over recognition, duty over glory." After Harrison left, the diner felt different, smaller somehow, yet filled with larger possibilities. Rebecca looked around at the familiar space, wondering how many other quiet heroes might be hiding in plain sight. "Why choose to fix cars?" she asked Tommy. "After everything you'd done, why something so ordinary?" Tommy's hands, she noticed for the first time, bore small scars that spoke of both mechanical work and other, more dangerous activities. "Because there's dignity in fixing things, Miss Chen. Every car I repair, every neighbor I help, those are real problems with real solutions. After years of dealing with threats you can't discuss and victories you can't celebrate, there's profound peace in work where you can see immediate results." Sarah approached with fresh coffee, her demeanor subtly changed. Not with awe or distance, but with a deeper appreciation for the man she'd served for years. "Tommy," she said gently, "Mrs. Patterson called. Her grandson wants to thank you for fixing his car last month. He got the job because he had reliable transportation." Tommy smiled. "That's what matters, Sarah. That boy has a future because a car runs properly. That's a victory worth having." Rebecca began to understand. "You found more meaning in helping Mrs. Patterson's grandson than in all those classified operations." "Not more meaning," Tommy corrected, "different meaning. Both mattered, but one I could do openly, honestly, as myself, rather than as a role I was playing." The reporter in Rebecca was already formulating questions about how many other veterans were living similar lives, how many unsung heroes were serving their communities in simple, profound ways. But the human being in her was learning something more important. "I've spent my career looking for corruption, exposing lies, finding the worst in people," she admitted. "I never thought to look for hidden goodness." Tommy nodded. "Both are necessary. Someone needs to expose wrongdoing, and someone needs to recognize virtue. Maybe that's your next story, not the heroes who couldn't be acknowledged, but the ones who choose not to be." As evening approached, Rebecca began writing a very different article. Not a retraction exactly, but a deeper exploration of heroism, service, and the courage required to choose anonymity over acclaim. The piece would run in Sunday's edition under a new headline, "The Heroes Among Us. When True Service Requires No Recognition." It would explore not just Tommy's story, but the broader truth about ordinary people who choose extraordinary service. Tommy Mitchell would return to his quiet life, continuing to fix cars and help neighbors. Rebecca Chen would continue investigating and reporting, but with a deeper understanding of what truth really meant. And Murphy's Diner would remain what it had always been, a place where coffee was strong, the service was friendly, and sometimes, if you paid attention, you might sit next to a hero and never know it. The real lesson wasn't about military service or classified operations. It was about the choice to serve others regardless